America is a wondrous experiment that has been going on for almost 250 years. And America has much to be proud of. The American experiment has created the longest surviving constitution in the history of the world, after defeating the unbeatable English Empire for its freedom. But while Thomas Jefferson declared that all men were created equal, the Constitution classified slaves as 3/5 of a person, and only then for determining representation in Congress. Slavery is the greatest sin of America, and would not be ratified until a civil war almost tore the country apart. It's no wonder then that many African Americans who escaped slavery, or were blessed to be born free, would seek freedom from oppression, bondage, lynching, and migrate away from the United States. Many African Americans fled north to Canada, while others went south to Haiti and Mexico. But some traveled across the sea to France and Africa. But one place that many African Americans fled to find freedom, equality, and prosperity that is forgotten to history is Soviet Russia? Yes, it's true. Welcome to another episode of Beyond History with Teacher Eddie, where we're going to talk about the African American diaspora that went to, of all places, Moscow. Let's get into it. Black people in Russia was nothing new. Going back to the Russian Empire of the 1700s in the court of Peter the Great, Abram Petrovich Ganibal, a Russian of African descent, became a general and a nobleman in the Russian Empire, and was the grandfather of Alexander Pushkin, arguably Russia's greatest author and poet, renowned as the father of modern Russian literature. After being kidnapped as a boy, Abram Petrovich Ganibal was sold into slavery in 1704, and eventually gifted to the Tsar of Russia, Peter the Great, who immediately not only freed him but adopted him as his own godson. As an adult, Ganibal rose to nobility and served the Russian Empire in both civil and military capacities. His son Ivan Ganibal also became a Russian military leader and retired in 1784 as a general. Throughout the 1800s, many more African Americans would flee the United States, and those who come to Russia during the Tsarist era find themselves treated as equals. No black and white boundaries existed. When the poet Langston Hughes visited Russia in the 1930s, he stated that, while not many, brown skins in Moscow were no rarity when we arrived. While we were there, the 22 colored folks from Harlem were lionized by the Russian people to no end. And at cultural gatherings, we were always introduced as representatives of the great black people. In the late 1700s and into the 1800s, it was common to see numerous black sailors in Russian port cities. The Russians assumed that while all the English-speaking white men were British, that the black men that they saw were typical Americans, not slaves, not servants. One of these cases in 1809, a servant known simply as Nelson accompanied the family of future United States President John Quincy Adams. While traveling to St. Petersburg, Nelson ends up staying in Russia with Adams' permission. Nelson found employment in the palaces of Russia in the service of Tsar Nicholas I, along with another black man who escaped servitude, Alexander Gabriel, whom the Tsar employs as a chef. There are many stories like this throughout the 1800s. One such story is of Nancy Gardner Prince, who was an African-American woman born free in Newburyport, Massachusetts. On February the 15th, 1824, Nancy Gardner marries Nero Prince, also an African-American, and they set sail for Russia, where she opens a boarding home and made clothing for infants, including the Tsar and Tsarina's children, while her husband was a footman for the Tsar in St. Petersburg. When she returns to the United States after the death of her husband, she begins writing her autobiography in 1850 and included great details of her time in Russia. Frederick Bruce Thomas, the son of ex-slaves, escaped with his family from the Mississippi Delta in 1890. By 1894, he had ventured to Europe seeking opportunities that he could not find in America. He arrived in Moscow in 1899, where he worked his way up from a waiter to the owner of Yar, which was the most fashionable restaurant in the city of Moscow. And by 1911, he had also partnered to establish an extremely successful variety theater called Maxim. By the early 1900s, a number of African American professionals could be found in Russia. Many entertainers also found great success in touring troupes who profited from the vogue of popular black culture in Europe. The famous Pearl Hobson was part of this group, arriving in Russia in 1904. She became a sensation in Moscow and St. Petersburg by 1909. Hobson ended up living in Russia until 1916. Even the first African-American heavyweight champion of the world, the great Jack Johnson, had to stay in Moscow until 1914, but ended up leaving due to the conflict that would become World War I. World War I was devastating to Russia and led to the 1917 Bolshevik Revolution. By 1919, the Bolsheviks, or communists, gained effective control of the country. The Russian Revolution of 1917 was dedicated to economically and politically transforming the nation and leading a worldwide revolution. The new communist leadership under Vladimir Lenin declared that African Americans would be in the vanguard of that revolution. They also declared that communists everywhere would fight to eradicate racism, as well as capitalism and imperialism. For the first time in history, the leader of a powerful European nation declared as its priority the elimination of racial discrimination around the world. Lenin stated that the experience of the Negro throughout the world was the best example of everything wrong with capitalism and imperialism. Understandably, many African Americans took interest in the Soviet Union. By the 1930s, Joseph Stalin is now in charge, and he has a vision of industrializing Russia, making it a superpower on the world stage. He needs not only labor, but skilled labor, and he turns to America to find many desperate skilled workers with the knowledge that he required. Many skilled laborers were struggling in the United States due, of course, in no small part to the Great Depression. So it's no surprise that this was especially of interest to African Americans, because not only were they dealing with a depression, but also racism, spearheaded by Jim Crow laws and segregation. They saw a new country being shaped post-revolution, stating that there were no races or classes, but only workers. The ranks of African Americans who leave the United States for Russia during this recruitment period included graduates of historically black colleges, such as the Tuskegee University and the Hampton Institute. They were engineers, educators, entertainers, journalists, lawyers. And the Soviets gave African Americans red carpet treatment. The experience of African Americans who traveled to Soviet Russia was extremely positive, and in turn they make very valuable contributions to Soviet society, which was what Joseph Stalin was looking for. The actor and activist Paul Robeson, as well as the great poet Langston Hughes, also traveled to Soviet Russia in the 1930s. Encouraged by Soviet authorities in 1932, a distinguished group of 23 black actors and writers, including Langston Hughes and Paul Robeson, as well as Henry Lee Moon, traveled to Moscow. James Patterson, who was born in 1933, was a very famous Russian child actor, becoming also a naval officer and a poet of African American and Ukrainian descent. The poet Claude McKay met Leon Trotsky in 1922 and summarized the event for African American readers in an article for the NAACP's The Crisis. Even the black intellectual and political activist W.E.B. Du Bois took the first of several trips to the Soviet Union in 1926. New arrivals in the Soviet Union kept increasing in the early 1930s. New York schoolteacher Williana Burroughs, and Mississippi-born agricultural specialist Oliver Golden. They all arrived at different times and saw themselves playing different roles in building the new socialist utopia. And some of these individuals end up staying for several years, and many never even return to the United States. But unfortunately, like all good things, they have to end. By the end of the 1930s, things take a turn for the foreigners in Soviet Russia, especially once Stalin signs the Non-Aggression Pact with Germany in 1939. During the era of Joseph Stalin's purges, foreigners were viewed with suspicion, and non-Soviet citizens were ordered to leave the country. But it is to be noted that African Americans were never targeted specifically for being black, only for being foreigners, as were their white counterparts. By the time of the Cold War in the late 1940s and 50s, when the US and Soviet Union were now open rivals and enemies, the idealistic notion of the USSR as a refuge and prototype of the anti-racist state had unfortunately lost its hold for all the African Americans who had migrated there. Today, unfortunately, the experience of black people in Russia is vastly different from those of the African American pioneers of the 1800s and 1900s. Soviet rule ended on December 25, 1991, with the resignation of Mikhail Gorbachev as the last premier of the Soviet Union. In its place now stood a dozen new nations, the largest and most powerful of which was the Russian Federation. The idea of a nation dominated by an ideology dedicated to eradicating racial discrimination also died as well with the USSR. One activist was quoted as saying, "Afro Russians want to feel Russian, but society doesn't want to recognize them as Russian."
У меня нет русской крови, но на ваш простой вопрос, как я себя чувствую, ни секунды не сомневаюсь, отвечаю вам, да, конечно же, русская.
Obviously, the United States and Russia have two vastly different histories, especially when it comes to the treatment of black people. And this part of history doesn't get talked about a lot, so that's why I wanted to include it in my Beyond History series. So I really hope you enjoyed it. If you have any suggestions for any other topics you'd like me to discuss, or any parts of history that you're not familiar with that you feel may be interesting, please leave a comment below. Let me also know what you thought of this video. I really appreciate it. And of course, check out one of our other videos or check out a playlist. I've been Teacher Eddie. This has been Beyond History, and I will see you next time.